After my wife's death, my children claimed I was starting to lose my mind. They compiled a list of my symptoms and insisted on a psychiatric evaluation. But they didn't know the doctor already knew the truth, because I had chosen him myself, and our session was being recorded for their own protection. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Fremont. I was 79 years old when I first entered Dr. Eldridge's office. I had served 38 years in U.S. Army intelligence, psychological operations, interrogations, behavioral profiling. My field wasn't war, it was people. Their patterns, their cracks, the way their hands moved when they lied, the way their pupils widened at the mention of guilt. I had interviewed spies, defectors, terrorists, generals, and once, a Secretary of State under investigation. I never raised my voice. I never interrupted. I let the silence expand like a net. Most people got tangled in their own words. The day I stepped into that office, I carried nothing but my coat, a black notebook, and a folded letter in my inner pocket. I noticed immediately what was absent. There were no mirrors, not in the hallway, not on the walls, not above the sink tucked in the corner, not even a reflective surface on the file cabinet. That was the first signal. A room designed for unguarded minds, not vanity. A space for what was inside to surface without the distraction of appearance. I knew then I wasn't walking into a trap. I was stepping into the theater of truth, one I had helped design decades ago, half a world away. The floor was covered with a Persian rug, worn thin in the middle. Not because it was old, but because most patients, when speaking, paced. I could almost see the arc of movement, like a pendulum tracing time. The walls were lined with dense bookshelves, all nonfiction. Psychology, military history, trauma studies, neurology, memory, and aging. A single shelf had books on ethics, law, and forensic psychiatry. I scanned the spines without moving my head, counting familiar titles like old friends in a room of strangers. I paused at one. Learned Helplessness and Control. I had co-authored the research cited in Chapter 4. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar oil. Clean, masculine, functional. There were no personal photos, no signs of sentimentality. The only decoration was a framed quote etched on a brass plate. A lie can sprint, but the truth walks forever. I had read that on the wall of a black site in Northern Europe in 1982. It made me feel strangely at ease. The man behind the desk had done his reading. I sat down in the chair across from the leather armchair. It was slightly lower by design, making the person in the armchair feel taller, more secure. I didn't mind. I leaned back, rested my hands on my thighs, and kept my eyes level. I hadn't been in an official interview position since my retirement in 2006, but it came back without hesitation. Posture, breathing, control of gaze, restraint of micro-movements. I was here as a civilian now, but part of me was still in uniform. The desk was arranged with geometric precision, not compulsively so, just clean. A glass of water sat on a coaster, a legal pad, untouched, a black pen perfectly parallel to the edge. A small rectangular object on the far left corner caught my eye. A digital recorder. Switched off, not hidden, placed like a chess piece before the opening move. I respected that. It meant honesty would be expected, and accountability assumed. I didn't ask for permission to sit. I didn't have to. The window behind the desk overlooked a quiet street in the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia. The blinds were half closed, letting in a soft, filtered light. There were no surveillance cameras, no assistants, just the ticking of a mechanical clock on the shelf, probably chosen for its psychological effect, a steady, calming rhythm. But to me, Each tick was a question, and each question had an answer. I crossed my legs slowly and took a breath through my nose. My heartbeat was steady. I felt no fear, only an acute awareness of the moment. There was nothing here to distract from the work, no decor to interpret, no clutter to decode, just a man, a room, and soon, a record. The air conditioning unit clicked on, just once. Cool air flowed briefly through the vent above the door, then stopped. It reminded me of the holding rooms we used in South Korea, regulated to prevent physiological cues from interfering with psychological reads. The absence of temperature shifts told me the environment was meant to reflect the subject, not influence him. I waited exactly 2 minutes. I knew that because I had counted my breaths, 14 per minute, shallow and controlled. I didn't look at my watch. I didn't need to. I heard a soft footstep in the hallway, the rustle of a sleeve against a doorknob. Then, stillness. I remained seated, hands folded loosely, gaze level. This was not a performance. This was not a defense. This was my environment now, not theirs. The family that sent me here didn't understand what it meant to choose silence over protest. They mistook it for surrender. But silence was the first step in any operation. Noise could always be used against you. Stillness, however, was unassailable. They had drawn up documents, scheduled the appointment, and sent over their concerns. A 3-page letter typed in 11-point font, double-spaced. The language was clinical, but I could see the fingerprints of emotion beneath every bullet point. He speaks to himself in the basement. He believes the television sends signals. He hoards food and locks doors unnecessarily. He suspects people of watching him. I had read each line without blinking and smiled, not at the accusations, but at their predictability. What they didn't realize was that paranoia, in the right hands, was just heightened awareness. And the television I spoke to was on mute because I was reading the subtitles of a Senate hearing. The basement was where I repaired old radio equipment, not where I plotted revenge. And the locked doors, a habit from 25 years of high-clearance protocol. They didn't understand the difference between symptoms and systems. What struck me most wasn't their ignorance. It was the confidence with which they submitted their case, as though I wouldn't see the motive, as though I had already gone blind with age, weak with grief, dulled by solitude. But the years hadn't dulled me. They had sharpened me into something quieter, leaner, and harder to predict. That frightened them, and so, like all frightened people with power, they moved to contain the unknown. I heard the latch turn softly. The door opened exactly halfway. A man in his early 60s, tall, lean, with military bearing, stepped in. He wore a charcoal gray suit, no tie, and carried a thin black folder. His eyes met mine without judgment, only assessment. I could see the calibration behind them, the instant scan for posture, scent, tremor, coherence. He didn't smile. Neither did I. That was our introduction. He sat in the armchair and placed the folder on the table between us. The recorder remained untouched. I didn't need to look at him again. I kept my eyes on the corner of the room, where the afternoon sun created a sharp line across the carpet. I watched the shadow lengthen, millimeter by millimeter. Time was passing, and everything was being noted, by him and by me. No questions had been asked yet, no answers given. But I had already made my statement. I was here, present, aware, not broken, not fading, just waiting. And in that waiting, I held the most powerful weapon I had ever known: preparation. This room wasn't for confession, it was for calibration, for alignment, for the quiet recording of truths that others tried to bury in fear and paperwork. There were no mirrors in that room because no reflection was needed. The truth was already seated in the chair, and it was watching. It arrived on a Tuesday. Not by accident. I had taught my son well. Tuesday was a low-pressure day, statistically speaking. People were less likely to resist bad news midweek, less likely to raise their voice or shut down a conversation. His timing was perfect. His delivery, equally precise. A large manila envelope, placed not in the mailbox, but directly on the small wooden table on my front porch, visible through the storm door, waiting like a warning. I brought it inside without opening it. I placed it on the kitchen table beside the half-finished crossword and a cold cup of coffee. The paper felt heavy in my hand. Not by weight, by intent, the kind of weight you could feel through the fibers. I knew what it contained before I peeled back the flap. The warning signs had been there for weeks. Shorter phone calls, stiff smiles, fewer visits, that subtle shift in tone from concerned to patronizing. It all led to this. I slid the contents out carefully. 3 sheets, laser printed, no smudges, neatly stapled in the top left corner. There was a cover page with a title in bold, Behavioral Concerns Regarding Harold Fremont. I let the phrase rest in my mind for a moment. Cold, clinical, strategic. I had read thousands of similar documents over my career, assessments, risk evaluations, threat profiles. This one was no different in structure, but painfully different in origin. The second page began with a bullet point list. No introduction, no greeting, no signatures, just a sequence of statements masquerading as observations. I read each one slowly, letting the rhythm of their phrasing fall into place. They had studied me like a subject, observed, recorded, compiled. My son, no doubt, had taken the lead, a corporate lawyer with a fetish for structure. My daughter, a speech pathologist, likely added the emotional color. Together, they built a narrative they could present as neutral, objective, undeniable. He locks his bedroom door at night, even when no one else is home. He refuses to let anyone into the basement and becomes agitated when questioned about it. He insists on using cash for all purchases, despite having a functioning credit card. He believes neighbors are monitoring his activity. He speaks aloud in empty rooms, often in a low voice, as if addressing someone not present. He covers his computer camera with tape. He keeps old military equipment, including communications gear, in working order. He has dismantled and reassembled the smoke detectors several times without clear reason. He watches congressional hearings and C-SPAN for hours, taking notes. He accused the gardener of casing the house because he looked at a window. There were more, each one delivered without context, interpretation, or warmth, as if the mere act of deviation from their comfort zone constituted madness. I read them twice, 3 times, not to understand their meaning, but to map their fear. I had seen this kind of list before, in war zones, in regime shifts, in corporations being sanitized for acquisition. You isolate the anomaly, document the deviations, build a paper wall of concern, then remove the liability. The most painful part was not the items themselves. I had done all of those things, every single one, but none of them were irrational, not to someone with my background. Locking doors wasn't paranoia, it was habit. Keeping old radios functional wasn't obsession, it was preparedness. Watching government broadcasts wasn't delusion, it was citizenship. I wasn't spiraling, I was maintaining discipline. The world had changed its expectations, softened, and blurred its standards. I hadn't. I turned the pages slowly, letting my fingers brush the ink. I studied the language, the passive constructions. It has been noted, there is concern that the subject appears to believe. Clever. No direct accusations, just implications. A lawyer's handiwork, designed to provoke concern, not debate. Designed to raise questions, not answer them. On the final page, they had listed recommended next steps. That part made me smile, not from amusement, but recognition. It was the format I had used in hundreds of internal memos, and now it was being used on me. 1. Psychiatric evaluation by independent third party. 2. Cognitive assessment, memory, processing, language. 3. Safety audit of home environment. 4. Consideration of durable power of attorney. 5. Discussion of possible long-term care options. The mask was off. They had already decided. This wasn't a proposal. This was a soft coup, a clinical annexation of my autonomy, my thoughts, my routines, my history, all reduced to symptoms. I had become a case file. I placed the papers neatly back into the envelope. I didn't shred them. I didn't burn them. I logged them, indexed them, stored them, because that's what I had always done with enemy documents. And make no mistake, I had crossed the threshold that all old soldiers fear, the moment when the threat is not outside the walls, but within the family tree. Later that afternoon, I walked into the study, a small room on the second floor with 2 windows facing the street. I pulled the blackout curtain halfway down and sat at the desk, the same desk where I used to plan operations in retirement, logistics for veterans groups, travel arrangements, letters to colleagues. Now I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I wrote one word at the top: assessment. Then I began a new list, not of my behaviors, of theirs. Son calls only to discuss financial matters. Tone abrupt. Daughter visits monthly, spends most of visit on phone. Recent interest in deed transfer documents. Suggested moving into assisted facility twice in 1 week. Installed smart devices in kitchen without consent. Suggested hiring house manager to help with daily confusion. I filled 2 pages before stopping, not because I had run out of observations, but because I already saw the pattern. A convergence of concern, greed, and modern convenience. It was easier to declare a man broken than to understand the integrity of his boundaries. Easier to pathologize solitude than to reckon with the shame of absence. They called it love. I called it strategic containment. By evening, I sat in the basement, surrounded by old files, maps, tools, and silence. I turned on the shortwave radio, not to listen, but to mask the quiet. I sipped my tea and reviewed the envelope again. Each time I read it, the anger burned a little less. In its place, something colder settled in. Not resentment, not vengeance, just clarity. I had trained myself to see through fabrications, to parse motive from mannerism, to decode what people truly feared based on what they tried to control. And now, for the first time in my life, the enemy wore my name. Not as a disguise, but as a burden they no longer wanted to carry. They didn't want their father. They wanted a version of him they could manage. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from stress, but purpose. I drafted a letter to an old contact in the Department of Veterans Affairs, a man who owed me a favor. I outlined the situation in plain terms. I included the behavioral report, my own notes, and a request. I didn't specify what the request was. I didn't need to. The next morning, I walked to the post office, mailed the letter, and returned home by sunrise. The street was quiet. The air smelled of pine mulch and low fog. I stood on the porch, looked at the place I had called home for 42 years, and made a silent promise to myself. This wouldn't end with them winning. It would end with the truth. Documented, precise, and unflinching. The way I had always done it. The morning after I received their assessment, I changed all the clocks in my house. Every one of them. Not because I feared losing track of time, but because I needed time to belong to me again. I reverted them to the 24-hour military format, just as I had done in every forward operations base I had ever been assigned to. Air 700, 1100, 1540, 2300. The world, in its civilian softness, preferred vagueness, AM, PM, sometime after lunch, around 6. But I wanted precision. I needed structure. Time, like memory, was only useful when measured with discipline. From that day on, I began to live as if I were preparing for an operation. I woke at 05:30 sharp. My body had not forgotten how to rise on command. I folded my blanket into thirds, opened the curtains to inspect the street, and brewed black coffee. 1 tablespoon per 6 ounces of water. No sugar, no cream. I read the paper with a pen in hand, underlining phrases that felt rehearsed or suspiciously constructed. The world was full of coded language, if one knew where to look. After breakfast, I began writing again. Not letters, not journals, reports. I documented each interaction, each expression, each deviation from the norm. If my daughter sent a message asking if I had taken my medication, I noted it. If my son forwarded an article on senior wellness or cognitive decline in isolation, I archived it. I created folders for them, 1 green, 1 red. I labeled them not with names, but with case numbers, HF001 and HF002. Habit dies hard, but more than that, it was necessary. I counted down the days to the psychiatric evaluation like I had once counted the days before deployment. I circled the date on the calendar in red ink, 28th. The circle was not for remembrance. It was a target. Each day had a purpose. I assigned myself a mental regimen. Mondays were observation days. I left the house, walked the same 3 blocks, and noted who waved, who looked away, who watched too long. Tuesdays were audit days, checking locks, testing windows, inspecting basement storage. Wednesdays were review, going over legal documents, scanning my medical records, cross-referencing anything my family could exploit. Thursdays were memory drills. I tested myself using old CIA flashcards I had made decades ago for recruits. Faces, names, phrases in Pashto, dialects from the Caucasus. I scored myself with brutal honesty. Fridays, I allowed myself silence. No news, no books, no phone, just the hum of the house and my own breathing. I wasn't unraveling. I was calibrating. They thought they could build a case by cherry-picking fragments of my behavior, but I had lived too long in the world of intelligence to be unprepared. They wanted to paint me as erratic. I became methodical. They expected confusion. I became exact. They hoped I'd resist the appointment. I embraced it. I contacted Dr. Eldridge on my own terms, not through family channels, but directly. I located him using a private veterans database, a favor cashed in from a former field psychiatrist I had once helped exfiltrate from a compromised NGO in Beirut. The man owed me. He confirmed Eldridge's reputation immediately. Former Navy psychiatrist, expert in trauma-related cognitive distortion, unaffiliated with my local health networks, incorruptible. That last part mattered most. I reached out to Eldridge with a short letter, typewritten on my old Underwood. I outlined my background, my family's intentions, and my willingness to participate in the evaluation, provided the session would be recorded, provided full transcripts would be shared with both parties, and provided no conclusions would be drawn before the meeting. I did not threaten. I did not beg. I stated terms. A day later, I received a reply. Handwritten, efficient, respectful. He agreed. The session was set. The clock began. I began logging my sleep patterns next, not because I was tired, but because I knew fatigue was often weaponized in evaluations. I kept track of REM cycles, hydration, blood pressure. I visited my general physician under the pretext of a routine checkup and requested full blood panels. I had him send me the results, not my children. I flagged them and stored them with the rest of my materials. Control wasn't a concept to me. It was a language I spoke fluently. In the evenings, I rehearsed. Not lines, expressions, emotional containment, breathing rhythms, the angle of my head when asked something accusatory. the precise pause between question and answer. I had trained foreign operatives in interrogation resistance. Now I was applying the same protocols to myself, not to deceive, but to survive the trap they thought they were laying. They called more frequently in those weeks, both of them, alternating like guards on a watchtower. My daughter's voice always carried a kind of wet concern, the kind reserved for stray animals. My son sounded like a man updating a spreadsheet. I answered with polite distance, logged the calls, and noted the timing. Their questions were never about me, not the real me, only about routines, medications, finances, whether I'd spoken to anyone about feeling off. They were probing for weaknesses, looking for signs that the countdown was getting to me. But all they did was confirm their own nervousness. People forget that pressure doesn't always reveal cracks. Sometimes it reveals shape, and mine was hardening. I cleaned the house one room at a time, not out of vanity, but because I wanted every object in place. If anyone came looking, I didn't want disorder to be interpreted as dysfunction. I fixed the hinge on the cabinet door, replaced a flickering light in the laundry room, rearranged the books in alphabetical order by author. I wasn't trying to impress. I was constructing a perimeter. A clean environment speaks volumes in an assessment. It says, I see, I care, I function. I moved my most sensitive documents to a locked case in the crawl space under the den. I changed the combination lock, a 4-digit number that no one would guess. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a military ID. It was the number of days my wife and I had been married. A number only I remembered, because I had never stopped counting. Each night I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed and reviewed the case I had built. My family thought they were collecting evidence. They didn't know I had been doing the same. And where their evidence was emotional, mine was procedural. Where theirs was biased, mine was verified. Where theirs was fear, mine was logic. I had photographs, bank statements, voicemails. I had printed every article my daughter had forwarded about cognitive decline and annotated them with dates and sarcastic marginalia. I even had screen captures of the browser history my son had accidentally left open on my laptop one Sunday afternoon. Searches for emergency guardianship forms and parent deemed unfit legal steps. They were sloppy. They were overconfident. They didn't know they were going up against someone who had dismantled terrorist cells using only phone records and an atlas. Someone who once talked a man with a detonator out of a suicide mission in 10 minutes by observing the pressure points on his hands. Someone who had spent his life anticipating betrayal, and who had never expected it to come in such a mundane, paper-clipped form. The night before the appointment, I slept 6 hours and 14 minutes. I woke up at 04:30, not from anxiety, but readiness. I shaved carefully, wore a gray wool sweater, polished my shoes, ate toast with almond butter and half an apple. By 0700, I was in the study, reviewing my notes. By 0900, I was sitting in the car, engine idling, watching the second hand of my watch mark each silent beat. The final countdown had begun. And for the first time in weeks, I felt not anger, not sadness, but clarity. I was no longer reacting. I was leading. The assessment wasn't a test of my mind. It was a test of theirs. And the clock was ticking. It began with footsteps, not the heavy kind that announce arrival, but the hesitant, near-floating rhythm of someone trying not to be heard. I recognized that gait instantly. I had heard it before, in airbases, safe houses, interrogation corridors. You don't forget the particular sound of caution. It always means there's something being hidden or something about to be uncovered. In this case, the person walking wasn't a spy. It was my daughter. She thought I was asleep. It was late, past midnight, and the house had long settled into its natural creaks and moans. I had turned off the lights in my room and pulled the covers high to give the illusion of rest. But my eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, counting seconds between each floorboard groan. I had learned as a young man that sound carries differently at night. Wood expands, ducts shift, but human movement remains unmistakable. She moved slowly down the hallway toward the study. I heard the subtle rustle of paper, her bag, likely. Then the soft click of the study door. It didn't latch unless pushed hard, and I didn't hear the latch engage. That meant she intended to return quickly. Her confidence surprised me. She must have assumed I had reached the stage of decline where late-night movement wouldn't register. Or maybe she thought I was medicated. Either way, she underestimated me. The house was built in 1952 with plaster and lath walls, not the soundproof drywall of newer construction. In the quiet, I could hear nearly everything through the ventilation shafts if I positioned myself correctly. And so I slipped from bed, barefoot, stepped softly into the hallway, and paused outside the guest room where my daughter had set her things down earlier. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't enter. I didn't need to. I only needed to confirm she was no longer in the room. She wasn't. I moved to the far end of the corridor and crouched beside the linen closet. Behind it ran a narrow panel concealing an old air return vent, one I had modified decades earlier to run thin wiring through when I experimented with passive surveillance equipment. Most of it had been stripped long ago, but the vent still offered excellent acoustics from the adjoining room, the study. I crouched and leaned in. My knees protested, but my focus drowned them out. Her voice came through first, soft, clipped. She was speaking into her phone. I recognized the cadence of her speech when she was nervous. It shortened. The words became clinical, half-mumbled, as if distancing herself from them would make them less real. She was listing things, recounting, cataloging. I caught fragments. Yes, he's still doing it. In the basement again yesterday. Won't throw anything away. He said the microwave watches him. I felt nothing as I listened. Not rage, not disbelief, just confirmation. Her voice was the evidence, the tone, the urgency, the rehearsed phrases. They weren't for me. They were for a record she was building, an alternative history of my mind. In her version, I was disoriented, delusional, possibly dangerous. In reality, I had never seen things more clearly. Then I heard another voice, male, distant, coming through her speaker. My son. I could make out the low baritone and certain telltale syllables. His phrases were always cleaner, more legalistic. We can't wait too long. If he resists, we'll have to push harder. Just make sure he's isolated first. If he has documents, they need to be secured. It wasn't conversation. It was coordination. A strategy meeting whispered between bloodlines. There was no mention of love, no concern for well-being, only logistics. She responded with new energy, emboldened by his certainty. She said she had tried bringing up long-term care and that he just laughed it off. She reported that I spend hours in silence and that I watch government proceedings obsessively. She mentioned the folders in the basement, and he told her to get pictures if possible. I breathed slowly, counting to 10 between each inhalation. My training surfaced like muscle memory. I remained perfectly still. Even the air around me felt heavier, like it had heard too much. I realized then that this wasn't about protecting me. It never had been. It was about control, territory, narrative. They didn't want a father. They wanted an asset transferred and sealed. The whispering continued for another 10 minutes. She mentioned a name, someone from a health network. I remembered it. I had seen it in the corner of a document she left in the kitchen last week, just for a moment. Dr. Leah Branton, geriatric psych specialist. She was lining up witnesses. I made a mental note to run her credentials later through a private database I still had access to. Not all ghosts fade after retirement. Eventually, the study door closed. Her footsteps moved past me again, back to the guest room. The bed creaked, and the whispering stopped. I stood only after another 5 minutes had passed. I walked calmly to the basement door, opened it, and descended into the darkness without turning on the light. I knew the steps. I knew the weight of the air. The basement had always been my space, the one place left untouched by their hands. It held my tools, my files, my memory. Down there, beneath the hum of the water heater and the cool concrete, I kept the unspoken chapters of my life. It wasn't clutter. It was architecture, a structure of continuity that allowed me to remember who I had been and what I still was. I opened the locked cabinet beneath the workbench and retrieved the recorder I had placed there 2 weeks ago, wired to the central air vent. It had caught everything. I didn't even need to play it back to know it had. I placed it into a padded envelope and labeled it Whispering, 2114 hours. Then I sat at the workbench, pulled out my green folder, HF001, and added a new page. Covert coordination, 14th October. Evidence secured. I wrote down every phrase I remembered. I transcribed her tone, his interruptions, the inflections. I annotated with timestamps based on the old wall clock above the shelves. I cross-referenced the statements with previous behaviors. My son's sudden interest in estate planning, my daughter's recent volunteering to clean out the basement, the security system notification that someone had disarmed the garage door alarm last Tuesday without logging a code. None of this surprised me. It only deepened the frame. I didn't expect loyalty. I didn't even expect kindness. I only expected clarity. And now I had it. I shut the folder and leaned back in the chair. The bulb above me swung slightly on its chain, casting elongated shadows across the shelves. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all, not as burden, but as gravity. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't confused. I was the last one in the house who still understood how to observe without permission. I closed my eyes and replayed their voices. I memorized the distance between their sentences, the space where guilt should have lived, but didn't. I had heard similar voices in foreign interrogation rooms, people who justified betrayal with concern, who wrapped manipulation in soft words. The only difference now was the bloodline. But blood, I reminded myself, does not guarantee truth. It only guarantees access, and they had just given me everything I needed. Through a wall, through a whisper, through the quiet arrogance of those who think the old no longer listen. The morning I prepared the envelope for Dr. Eldridge, the sky was overcast and low, the kind of pale, flattened gray that made the trees seem quieter, like they were listening. I stood at the dining room table, sleeves rolled, hands steady, placing each item in order with the same focus I once gave to classified packets bound for Langley. I wasn't assembling a plea. I was presenting a case. They had constructed a psychological profile using shadows and innuendo. I was answering with documentation. I began with the voice recording. I transferred the audio file from the basement device to a clean flash drive and labeled it by time and date, then placed it in a padded pouch. That file alone captured the coordination between my children, their whispered assumptions, their strategic language, their intent to quietly dismantle my autonomy. It wasn't enough to accuse them. I needed evidence that spoke without commentary. Their own words would suffice. Next came the copy of the behavioral dossier they had delivered. I made notes in the margins in blue ink, numbering the items, cross-referencing them to my own logs. Where they claimed confusion, I offered timestamps. Where they cited paranoia, I attached receipts, photographs, utility records. I highlighted one particularly absurd claim, that I had removed and reinstalled smoke detectors repeatedly, and attached an invoice from the city showing an upgrade inspection 3 weeks prior. They had no idea I had been logging their narrative as carefully as they had been constructing it. The third document I included was a psychological stress response chart from a military training manual I had helped revise in the early 1990s. I marked the similarities between their described erratic behaviors and the standard behavioral loop of a trained analyst under non-combat pressure. Hyper-awareness, need for control in environment, detachment from surface-level social norms, all standard, all known, all predictable. These were not pathologies. They were patterns of function, patterns they no longer recognized. The final sheet I included was personal, a handwritten letter, not emotional, not nostalgic. Simply a chronology, 20 bullet points, outlining my activities over the last 2 months. Visits to the bank, to the hardware store, to the library, books read, meals prepared, a copy of my grocery list, handwritten and sorted by store section. Annotations of the congressional hearings I had watched, noting timestamps and relevant amendments. I wasn't proving capability. I was proving precision. I didn't want Eldridge to see a confused man clutching to routine. I wanted him to see a man who had never stopped tracking reality. Once the contents were assembled, I placed them all into a plain white envelope and sealed it with a strip of clear tape. No return address. I didn't need one. The message was embedded in the material, not the presentation. I walked to the post office just before noon, placed the envelope in the hands of the clerk, and paid for overnight delivery. No emotion, no hesitation, just the ritual of forward motion. Back home, I waited. I didn't pace. I didn't check my phone. I cleaned the silverware drawer and repotted the dusty fern in the corner of the living room. I polished the old barometer mounted above the coat rack. I calibrated the pressure dial manually. These small acts weren't distraction. They were alignment. When the world around you begins to slip into illusion, you root yourself in physical certainties. 2 days later, I received a short envelope addressed in heavy black ink. Inside was a single note from Eldridge. Understood. I'll see you Thursday at 11:30. Session will be structured per your outline. It was not a gesture of solidarity. It was a professional's acknowledgement of another professional. The conversation had already begun. The days that followed were filled with silence from my children. No messages, no calls. I imagined them waiting, confident their plans were moving forward, unaware that the field had already shifted. They believed they were maneuvering around a weakened mind, but they were operating inside a structure I had already mapped. They were part of a protocol now. Their actions had been reduced to lines in a file. I used the interim to further refine my archive. I categorized the documents into labeled folders: perception, surveillance, financial motive, psychological projection. Each contained cross-referenced materials, logs, photos, timestamps, bank transfers. I began building a visual timeline of their involvement, highlighting when their shift from concern to control began. It wasn't sudden. It had developed gradually, like mold in a sealed room. Easy to miss, difficult to ignore once noticed. I also reviewed my own past, not for nostalgia, but for continuity. I dug out my old field assessments, thumbed through yellowing mission debriefs, reread essays I had written on threat analysis and subject manipulation. I wasn't trying to relive anything. I was remembering my own architecture, my sense of order, my trained ability to see patterns where others saw coincidence. It reminded me that I had not become what they claimed. I had simply remained what they no longer understood. On Wednesday evening, I received an email from Dr. Eldridge confirming the session. His tone was professional, clean, detached. He attached a consent form for audio recording and a document outlining confidentiality protections. He also included a brief note acknowledging receipt of the materials and stating that, in his opinion, there was ample cause to examine the influence of external psychological pressure in the concerns raised by my family. That phrase, external psychological pressure, sat in my mind like a warm bullet. It was both diagnosis and indictment, not of me, but of them. They had tried to build a clinical case against a man who had spent his life studying the anatomy of control. And now that effort was being seen for what it was, not concern, but orchestration. That night, I slept 6 hours without interruption. I rose before dawn, stood by the window as the light shifted behind the trees, and felt the air press against the glass. The world was quiet, but it no longer felt like it was closing in. The trap they had laid had begun to invert, folding in on its architects. I didn't need to speak to defend myself. I had already spoken, in structure, in form, in proof. Thursday approached with a strange kind of stillness, not peace exactly, but readiness. My children thought they had submitted a list of delusions to be confirmed. What they had submitted was a blueprint of projection, soaked in fear and distance. They no longer knew how to relate to a man who didn't age the way they had scripted. They wanted decline. They wanted permission to erase discomfort. What they received was a dossier of their own blindness. I dressed with care that morning, not to impress, to remind myself who I was. Wool trousers, pressed shirt, the watch my wife gave me when I retired from government service. It ticked with a mechanical rhythm that had never failed. Like me, it ran without approval. When I stepped out into the sunlight, I felt no bitterness, no adrenaline, just gravity. I was carrying history in a slim leather folder, and I knew that for the first time in this entire quiet war, the assessment would be mutual. Diagnosis without examination had been their tactic. Now, the examination would be mine. In the days leading up to the evaluation, I allowed myself to be watched, not just passively seen, but intentionally observed. I opened the blinds wider. I left doors ajar. I stayed in common areas longer than usual. I made my movements slower, less precise. Every action was deliberate. Every pause had weight. I knew their eyes were on me, not always directly, but through the devices they introduced, through the neighbors they manipulated, and through their own distorted memories. I let my routines fray at the edges. One morning, I forgot to take the garbage out on time. On another, I poured a glass of juice and left it half full on the counter, untouched for hours. I turned the television to static and let it run for 5 minutes before turning it off. I walked from room to room with no visible purpose. None of these actions were errors. They were invitations. Observation, true observation, requires bait. A reason to linger. I knew if they were watching closely, and I was certain they were, they would see these small anomalies and feed them into the framework they had already built. They would add new notes to their mental file. He left a burner on. He was talking to himself again. He stared at the wall for several minutes. Each moment they misinterpreted was another thread in the net they thought they were weaving around me. But I had spent a lifetime watching people. Not glancing, not spying, watching. The way a person holds a pen when nervous, the way their eyes slide sideways when they lie, the barely perceptible clench of the jaw when they're suppressing guilt. My children had none of the training, none of the patience. They thought they understood behavior because they had lived with mine. But they weren't reading me. They were reading their own discomfort. I left one of my notebooks open on the kitchen table. Page 4, a list of items under the heading Unusual Patterns. I used vague, suggestive language. Microwave reflection, 9:14 p.m. Ringing, left ear only. Window flicker, southeast corner. I wrote them in uneven lines, switching pens halfway through. It looked erratic, unsettled, designed that way. I left it there for 2 days, then tucked it away without comment. I knew it had been read. I found it placed slightly off-center one morning, the pen resting on the wrong page. They couldn't help themselves. They didn't understand that the moment someone starts documenting your decline, they reveal far more about themselves than about you. People collect what they fear. They label what they need to control. They diagnose what they can't predict. I watched them when they visited, I made tea with trembling hands, then carried the tray without a single spill. I asked them to repeat things, then recited the full conversation from memory 5 minutes later. I made spelling errors in crossword puzzles, then corrected them after they left. It wasn't performance, it was calibration. I was measuring the gap between their assumptions and reality, and that gap was growing. They whispered more, moved cautiously, left pamphlets on elder care facilities in plain sight. They mentioned neighbors whose parents had to go into care and casually referenced how smoother it was than expected. I nodded. I thanked them. I listened with the same blank expression I used in debriefings. Never confirm, never deny. Let them show their hand. Once, I found my daughter inspecting the medicine cabinet. She didn't know I had adjusted the mirror just slightly, enough to catch the reflection from the hallway. She opened each bottle, checked labels, shook them gently. I had removed the original medications a week before and replaced them with inert capsules, labeled identically. I wanted to see if she'd notice. She didn't, or didn't care. Observation becomes intrusion when driven by narrative, not truth. At night, I sat by the window with a small notebook and recorded every detail of their behavior. Not just what they said, but how they stood. The way my son hovered in doorways, never fully entering a room. The way my daughter touched surfaces when nervous, her fingers trailing across countertops, doorknobs, the backs of chairs. People try to anchor themselves physically when they know they're morally adrift. I noted how they began speaking to each other differently around me. Simpler language, slower cadence, as if translating English into some softer dialect I might better grasp. They smiled too much. Their voices rose unnaturally at the end of sentences, as if seeking approval for their own fiction. I didn't challenge them. I let them dig deeper into their performance. In the basement, I reassembled a small listening rig. Nothing elaborate, just enough to monitor frequencies from the smart devices in the house. My son had installed a voice assistant in the kitchen 6 months earlier. He said it was for convenience, to help with timers and grocery lists. He didn't think I understood what it actually did. He never asked why I kept a Faraday pouch in the cabinet above the refrigerator. I logged every unexplained activation, every keyword trigger. I saved the audio pings, time-stamped and labeled. He would have called it paranoia. I called it awareness. The irony was never lost on me. A man who had spent his life detecting deception, now watched by his own blood for signs of collapse. But what they saw as symptoms, I saw as echoes. Echoes of a world that had traded discipline for distraction, clarity for comfort. I had lived too long in truth to pretend otherwise. I set traps, small ones, invisible unless you knew where to look. A rearranged shelf, a moved photo frame, a marked page in a book. When things shifted without my doing, I knew they had been there. One morning, I found the back door unlocked, though I always double-checked it before bed. A week later, I discovered a receipt for a locksmith folded inside a gardening magazine. They were testing boundaries, checking access, mapping control. They were not malicious, but they were frightened. Frightened of aging, frightened of unpredictability, frightened of the mirror I held up simply by remaining unchanged. They saw shadows. I saw outlines. They saw decline. I saw design. Observation, I had once written, is not the act of watching. It is the art of waiting until the truth forgets it is being seen. And so I waited. I watched. And every breath they mistook for weakness was a record. Every glance they gave each other was a footnote. Every step they took in the direction of erasure, I logged in permanent ink. They believed they were documenting my fall. But I had already written the architecture of their intentions, and I had filed it under expected outcomes. The photograph had been in a drawer for almost 12 years. I had placed it there after my wife's funeral, unsure of whether I wanted to keep it visible, not because it held pain, but because it held stillness. An old stillness I feared would mute everything else. The image was from a summer trip to Flathead Lake in Montana. We were younger. The children were in their early teens. My wife wore a wide-brimmed hat, the one with the little fray on the side she never bothered to fix. I stood behind them, a hand on each of their shoulders. They looked away from the camera, distracted by something just outside the frame. That was the part I always found telling. Even then, they were focused on something else. I took it out the morning before the evaluation. I wiped the dust from the glass with the sleeve of my sweater and studied the edges. The wood had splintered slightly along one corner, and a spot behind the glass had yellowed near the bottom, likely from sunlight, though it looked almost like old water damage. I didn't change the frame. I wanted it to remain exactly as it was the last time it had been touched. Memory, I had learned, was not something you polished. It was something you preserved. I placed the photograph on the small side table next to the reading lamp in the study. Not on the center of the desk where it would demand attention, but just off to the side, where it could catch the eye naturally, as if it had always been there. I knew Dr. Eldridge would notice it. I knew what kind of man he was: trained, observant, quietly analytical. The placement would register. The faces would register. The absence of my own gaze in the photograph, that too would register. I didn't place the photo for sentiment. I placed it as context. I stood in the doorway for several minutes after setting it down, observing the room the way I imagined he would. I had arranged the books carefully, the medical texts, the volumes on ethics, the government white papers, all placed deliberately, subtly hinting at continuity. I had removed nothing from the space. I didn't want to curate a fiction. I wanted reality to speak for itself. But the photograph, that was the only addition, and it carried the most weight. In that image, my son's posture was slightly turned away from me. It wasn't intentional. At the time, it had seemed like the natural stance of a boy growing independent. But looking at it now, through the eyes of an investigator rather than a father, I saw distance. Not rebellion, but retreat. My daughter, on the other hand, leaned slightly toward her mother. Not clinging, but aligning. There was affection in her stance, but it had an exclusivity to it, as if she were already forming a private bond that would one day exclude me. My wife, she had looked directly into the lens, calm, clear, steady. She had always been the axis of our family, the translator, the diffuser, the builder of bridges between my structure and their softness. After her death, the space she left behind was not only emotional, it was functional. They stopped communicating in full sentences. They stopped arriving on time. They stopped listening altogether. I remembered the day the photo had been taken. I had set the timer on the camera and jogged into position, adjusting my collar just as the shutter clicked. We had grilled trout that evening. I had shown my son how to start a fire with just flint and dry pine needles. He nodded, bored, and asked to use the lighter instead. My daughter spent the night inside the camper, reading a novel with her mother. I sat alone by the fire for nearly an hour after everyone had gone to bed. I stared into the flames, wondering how a family can be together, and already drifting apart. Now, decades later, the photograph was an artifact, not of closeness, but of structure. A reminder that the fracture hadn't started recently. It had only widened. When Dr. Eldridge entered the study the next day, I watched his eyes travel across the room. He was subtle, too subtle for most, but I had read men under interrogation. I knew when someone clocked a detail and stored it. He saw the photograph within the first 15 seconds. He didn't comment. He didn't glance back at it again. But I knew he had archived it. That was enough. That evening, after the session, I sat in the same chair and looked at the image for a long time. I tried to recall the exact moment it had been taken, the wind off the lake, the sound of birds, the way the wood on the dock creaked under our feet. I remembered my son complaining about the bugs, my daughter asking if we could stop at a bookstore on the way back. I remembered how quiet my wife had been that afternoon. Not sad, just quiet, as if she too sensed that this version of our family wouldn't last much longer. I thought about removing the photograph again, tucking it back in the drawer, hiding the past in a compartment. But something stopped me. It wasn't just a picture. It was a message, not for them, for me. A reminder that the narrative they were constructing now, of confusion, of decline, of unreliability, was just one chapter in a much longer volume. A volume I had authored, page by page, day by day, through structure, observation, duty, and restraint. I had raised them, fed them, taught them to walk, taught them to lie still when the world shouted, taught them to distinguish between chaos and silence. And now they were trying to erase that authorship with a checklist of imagined symptoms. But I had this photograph, not as proof of love, but as a timestamp, a record, a reference point for when the fracture began. And in war, whether on a battlefield or across a dining room table, knowing the origin point is everything. Later that night, I adjusted the photograph slightly. I angled it half a degree toward the chair where Dr. Eldridge had sat. Not for symbolism, for continuity. I wanted it to stay visible, not to haunt, but to witness. I arrived 12 minutes early, not out of anxiety, but by design. I had always believed in owning the first moments of any encounter, even the silent ones. When you arrive first, the room is yours. You control the air, the temperature, the rhythm of time. That principle applied just as much in an embassy conference room as it did in a quiet psychiatric office in Northern Virginia. Dr. Eldridge's building was modest, a red brick structure tucked between a dental clinic and a law firm. The plaque outside read simply, Eldridge, Ph.D., Behavioral Assessment. There were no titles, no endorsements, no testimonials. Just a name. That too told me everything I needed to know. Men like him didn't advertise. Their reputations preceded them, or they worked with people who didn't ask for names. The waiting room was empty. Soft music hummed from speakers hidden somewhere behind the molding. Not classical, not ambient, something engineered to be unmemorable. A small glass table held exactly 3 magazines, spaced evenly apart. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old carpet. I took the seat farthest from the door. I didn't look at the magazines. I watched the clock. At precisely 10:59, the inner door opened. Dr. Eldridge stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. He nodded once. That was our entire greeting. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and followed him down the short hallway to his office. I took in every detail, the length of the corridor, the weight of the door, the sound of the latch behind me. I had done this 1,000 times before, just not on this side of the equation. The office was unchanged since my first visit. The same bookshelf, the same leather chair, the same framed quote on the wall above the window. But something was different. On the table between our chairs sat a small recording device, red light blinking softly. It was already running. I appreciated the choice. Transparency before preamble. I sat without being told. He gestured lightly toward the folder on the side table, the one I had sent him. He placed it on his lap, opened it, and flipped through several pages. He didn't read them again. He knew them already. The gesture was ceremonial, a signal that the contents were alive in the room. Then the door opened again. My daughter stepped in first, dressed in navy and gray, expression tight, holding a small notebook clutched too firmly in her hand. Behind her came my son, posture straight, suit pressed, face blank in that carefully neutral expression only corporate lawyers and guilty men learn to master. They had rehearsed this moment. I saw it in the synchronized way they moved toward their chairs, not mine, not Eldridge's, but 2 additional seats placed slightly off-center. I knew that seating was intentional, neither peripheral nor central, an illusion of inclusion. No one spoke. Eldridge didn't address me. He addressed the room, his voice even, low, metered. He outlined the purpose of the session: assessment, observation, exploration of perceived concerns raised by family, voluntary participation, mutual respect. I noted the phrase perceived concerns, a small detail but important. It created space for doubt. Language matters in rooms like these. My daughter was the first to speak. Her voice caught at the edges. She began with anecdotes, moments, incidents, things I allegedly said, did, forgot. She cited dates, times, behaviors. I watched her mouth move, but I didn't hear her as a daughter. I heard her as a witness trying to sound like a child. Her words were carefully chosen, but her body betrayed her. She twisted her ring constantly, adjusted her sleeves, shifted her weight with each sentence. I wrote the patterns silently in my head: discomfort, projection, evasion. Then came my son. He took a different approach, less emotion, more structure. He spoke of legal obligations, safety, fiduciary responsibility. He used terms like guardianship, capacity, protective measures. It was not a son speaking of a father. It was an attorney building a case. But the problem was he had no case, just a set of assumptions dressed in polished language. He gestured toward the list they had submitted. Eldridge didn't pick it up. As they spoke, I watched Eldridge. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He wrote in short strokes, never more than a few words at a time. His eyes didn't move from the speaker, but I knew he was listening in layers, to what was said, what was unsaid, and what was betrayed by the room's energy. He didn't react when my son spoke of the incident with the smoke detectors, or when my daughter mentioned that I believed the TV was watching me. He simply let the words accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a river. When they finished, he turned to me. He asked no questions. Instead, he said only one thing: "Would you like to respond?" I didn't shift. I didn't sigh. I kept my hands flat on the arms of the chair and spoke in a steady voice. I acknowledged their concerns. I validated their feelings. Then I dismantled their narrative, piece by piece, using dates, records, facts. I referenced the city work order that explained the smoke detector replacements. I cited the specific congressional session I had watched the day they claimed I was talking to the television. I explained my use of cash as a preference, not a symptom. I detailed my sleep patterns, my reading list, my interactions with neighbors. I recited the names of the last 4 books I had finished, in order, with summaries. I described a documentary I had watched the night prior, quoting a passage from it that related to generational perceptions of aging. I did not raise my voice. I didn't defend. I clarified. Then I paused, and I looked directly at Eldridge. I informed him that I had recorded a conversation in my home, a conversation in which both of my children discussed strategies to influence the outcome of this session, using language that suggested predetermined conclusions and legal preparation for guardianship. I said I had provided that recording, along with transcripts in the folder he had reviewed. I said nothing more. He didn't look at the folder. He looked at them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was surgical. My daughter stopped twisting her ring. My son opened his mouth, then closed it. Their bodies shifted backward by half an inch, the universal signal of retreat. Eldridge then turned to the recorder on the table and pressed the button. The red light stopped blinking. He said we would take a short pause. No one moved. I sat in that chair, not triumphant, not bitter, but exact. The session had begun, and it had already ended. After the session ended, I remained seated while the others stood. My children stepped into the hallway first. I heard the soft murmur of their voices as they moved toward the exit, a tone I knew too well. Controlled panic, masked in administrative calm. They would call it next steps later, when they debriefed each other over coffee. They wouldn't speak of the silence that had followed the mention of the recording, nor the flicker of doubt that passed across their faces when they realized this had never been about my confusion. It had always been about theirs. Dr. Eldridge gestured lightly toward the bookshelf beside his desk and asked if I would mind staying for a moment longer. I nodded once and leaned back into the leather chair. The room had shifted since the beginning of the session, not physically, but atmospherically. The temperature hadn't changed, yet everything felt sharper, more defined. The illusion that had floated through the space like fog was gone. What remained was clarity, unpleasant, irreversible, absolute. He walked to the bookshelf and retrieved a magazine, Psychological Quarterly, Winter Edition. I recognized it immediately. I had requested that specific issue be placed there several weeks ago through a mutual acquaintance in his administrative circle. I hadn't expected it to be on display so soon, but there it was. The cover story, in bold white letters across a grainy black and white photograph of an elderly man's silhouette, read, "Modern Gaslighting, Weaponizing Mental Health to Control the Aging Population." It was more than a headline. It was bait. He placed it on the table between us. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The article wasn't long, 3.5 pages, but it was dense with citations, case studies, expert interviews, and alarming trends. It outlined a growing tactic among families of aging individuals, particularly those with military or high-clearance backgrounds. Subtle manipulation framed as concern, legal pressure masked as protection, and the repackaging of independence as pathology. It documented how phrases like, "he's not himself anymore," or "she needs structure," had become codes for control. How adult children, fearful of inheritance disputes, burdened by resentment, or driven by quiet greed, would use the language of therapy to stage interventions that looked caring, but functioned like containment. The most chilling part of the piece wasn't its analysis, it was its familiarity. I could have written it myself. Eldridge tapped the corner of the magazine once with the back of his pen, and said only that the article had received a considerable amount of attention in clinical circles. He mentioned that several of the study's contributors were former VA doctors. One in particular, I had worked with briefly in Germany during a transitional evaluation program for field agents. I didn't react. I simply folded my hands and let the weight of the moment settle. That magazine had been placed there for one reason: to be noticed, not by me, by them. And they had noticed. During the session, my daughter's gaze had drifted to it twice. Once when she stumbled through a scripted anecdote about my obsession with routines, and again when my son mentioned their legal obligation to intervene before things became unsafe. I had tracked her eyes, how they narrowed, then widened, and how her fingers twitched as if wanting to remove the magazine from sight. My son had seen it too. He was more practiced at suppressing his reaction, but the pause in his rhythm was enough. He had read the title. He understood the implications. The beauty of the trap was its elegance. The article did not accuse. It illuminated. It did not point fingers. It held up a mirror. My children had walked into that office certain of their version of the story. They believed in their case. They believed in their language. But they didn't expect the narrative to already be public, not as fiction, but as fact. They didn't know that the very tactics they employed had been studied, published, debated, and now exposed. And they certainly didn't expect the man they were accusing to be connected to the architects of that exposure. I had made sure the magazine was recent enough to be relevant and credible enough to be taken seriously. I had cross-checked every footnote, every citation. The reference to the New Hampshire case, where a daughter had used fabricated symptoms to have her father institutionalized, and gain access to his assets, had been prominently featured in the second column of the first page. My children wouldn't say it aloud, but they had read it. The echo of it rang in the way their arguments weakened toward the end of the session. When Eldridge closed the magazine and returned it to the shelf, he didn't comment on it again. He didn't need to. The point had landed. I stood, buttoned my coat, and thanked him. His reply was simple. Not a diagnosis, not a verdict, just an acknowledgement. This was important. I stepped into the hallway and walked slowly toward the exit. My children were gone. I hadn't expected them to wait. They would need time to recover, to reframe, to decide whether they had merely overreached or whether they had fundamentally misjudged the strength of the man they were trying to disassemble. Outside, the air was cold and still. I crossed the parking lot with deliberate steps, every footfall a quiet reclaiming of ground. The trap had not been elaborate. It hadn't required deceit, only patience, only knowledge of how people behave when they think they are operating in the dark, only the understanding that the most dangerous enemy is the one who forgets that others can read. As I opened the car door, I looked once more at the building. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel victorious. I felt confirmed. They had tried to place me under glass, but they were the ones who had been studied. And now, the cover they feared most was no longer the photo on my shelf. It was the one staring back at them from the magazine rack. The first thing I noticed about Dr. Eldridge's notebook was its texture. It wasn't the standard lined legal pad that most clinical professionals used. It wasn't spiral-bound or leather-wrapped or embossed with a corporate logo. It was plain, dark gray, cloth-covered, and hand-stitched along the spine. The kind of notebook chosen with care, not convenience. That told me something before he had even opened it. It wasn't there to be filled. It was there to be curated. After the session, he had waited until the door closed behind my children before he reached for it. He placed it on the table between us, not as a gesture of finality, but as an invitation. I remained seated. The room was still. The recorder had been switched off. The soft hum of the HVAC system was the only sound. He didn't announce his conclusions. He simply opened the notebook and turned to a specific page, marked with a single paperclip. The handwriting was precise, uniform, and small. Each line aligned perfectly with the last, as if written under the guidance of a grid. There were no strike-throughs, no corrections, just short entries, bullet-pointed in black ink. He did not read them aloud. He let the page breathe between us. I leaned slightly forward and let my eyes scan the content. I wasn't reading for flattery. I was reading for accuracy. There were no labels like patient or subject. No psychiatric codes or assumptions dressed in polite language. There were just observations, clear, concise, and disturbingly thorough. Subject displays linear thought structure. Speech pattern controlled, unhurried, appropriate. Body language centered, symmetrical, aligned with content. Memory recall accurate, cross-verified. Emotional regulation intact, with conscious restraint. Situational awareness high. Environmental interaction deliberate. Social interpretation appropriately complex. That last line stayed with me. Appropriately complex. It implied something they had not expected, that I still held the capacity not only to navigate the world, but to interpret its nuances, that I could read intention, recognize subtext, measure shifts in tone. In other words, I wasn't confused. I was calibrated. On the adjacent page, separated by a fine ruled line, were notes labeled simply, Family Dynamic. There, the tone of the language shifted, not emotionally, but structurally. The entries were more analytical, almost forensic. Daughter demonstrates high emotionality, limited behavioral specificity. Son uses legalistic framing, attempts to dominate narrative. Language used suggests rehearsed coordination. Shared examples lack verifiable timestamps. Consistent emphasis on hypothetical risk versus actual behavior. Tone shifts significantly post-introduction of audio evidence. Visibly unsettled by presence of literature on familial manipulation. There was more. Not volumes, not a psychological autopsy, just what was needed. The notebook was a scalpel, not a sword. He turned another page. This one was handwritten in a slightly different pen, blue instead of black. The title at the top, Independent Assessment. Beneath it, a single paragraph written in complete sentences. No evidence of delusional thinking, cognitive fragmentation, or behavioral disintegration. Subject presents with high situational awareness, advanced pattern recognition, and structured thought. Historical behaviors align with professional background and context. Concerns presented by family appear subjective, lacking objective corroboration. Observed interactions suggest external pressure influencing family perspective. Recommend no further action. Autonomy should remain intact. Protective monitoring unnecessary. I read it twice. Slowly. There was no need to memorize it. The rhythm of the language burned itself into me. Not because it exonerated me. I didn't need permission to exist, but because it acknowledged something far rarer than innocence. It acknowledged that I was still whole. Eldridge closed the notebook without flourish. He didn't offer to make a copy. He didn't offer to send a follow-up report. He said only that a formal letter would be submitted to the appropriate agencies at my request. I nodded once. We both understood what that meant. Outside the window, the wind was bending the trees slightly, the branches swaying with the kind of rhythmic tension that comes just before a storm. The light had shifted across the office floor. I looked around one last time. The books, the framed quote, the worn carpet. And then I looked back at that notebook, still resting between us like a sealed document. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the counter-narrative, the formal documentation of a truth too inconvenient for my children to face. When I finally stood, he handed me a single sheet of paper, a copy of the summary statement from his evaluation. No embellishment, just facts, just the part the system required. The rest, the notebook, would remain with him. That was its power. It wasn't for courts. It was for the archive. I left his office with that paper folded neatly in my coat pocket. I didn't rush. I didn't look over my shoulder. I walked to my car with the same deliberate pace I'd used crossing tarmacs in foreign countries, stepping over shadows that had tried to shape me into something else. They had written their version of me in bullet points, laced with worry and coated in strategy. He had written mine in silence, detail, and steel. And between those two accounts, I had found the only truth that ever mattered. My clarity had been recorded, and my freedom, quietly notarized in the folds of a doctor's notebook. The courthouse was smaller than I remembered. Red brick facade, pale columns, a flag that barely stirred in the stale spring air. I had stood in places of power before, Pentagon hallways, embassy corridors, military tribunals held in heat-scorched tents. But this building carried a different kind of gravity. Not because it was larger or grander, because here, stories became decisions, and stories, when told poorly, could steal your life. I wore a gray suit, pressed the night before with an iron that hissed like it was remembering something. My tie was black. No pattern. No expression. A quiet signal that I wasn't there for theater. I arrived early. I always arrived early. I stood outside for a few minutes, watching others filter in. A woman clutching custody papers. A man in a cheap blazer wiping sweat from his brow. A child with headphones too large for his ears. I noted everything. I had learned long ago that what surrounds the event always reveals more than the event itself. Inside, the air was cool, dry, processed through vents that hadn't been cleaned in years. My name was called just once. No emotion in the clerk's voice, no warmth, just sequence, a case number, a docket, a room. The hearing room wasn't large, a few benches, a raised platform, 2 flags, one national, one state. The judge sat already, female, mid-50s, sharp eyes behind conservative glasses. Her robe didn't hide the posture of someone who had heard every excuse and survived them all. I liked her immediately. My son sat to my left, my daughter beside him. Both wore their concern like freshly purchased coats, neat, uncreased, ill-fitting. Their lawyer, someone I had never met, sat with a tablet in front of him, fingers steepled, eyes half-lowered. He reminded me of a type, not a predator, a scavenger, opportunistic, risk-averse, cold-blooded. I had no lawyer beside me. That was intentional. The petition had been filed under the language of protection, temporary guardianship pending psychological evaluation. They cited instability, delusional thinking, paranoia. They referenced long absences from communication, erratic behavior, refusal to accept support. All language chosen carefully to sound clinical without sounding cruel. They didn't look at me when they spoke. They looked at the judge, as if I were a story being told rather than a presence in the room. The judge asked them to present their documentation. They offered the folder, thick, printed, tabbed. My daughter's handwriting marked the margins of some pages. I recognized the highlighted phrases: safety concerns, increased isolation, fixation on surveillance. Then the judge turned to me and asked if I had any statement to make. I did not read from a paper. I did not speak with flourish. I spoke plainly, chronologically, with restraint. I outlined my daily routines. I referenced Dr. Eldridge's report, which had been submitted the day before and was already in her hands. I offered specific dates, actions, receipts. I acknowledged the changes they observed, but explained them within the context of a structured, solitary life built by design, not decline. I did not defend. I clarified. Then the judge asked if I had brought any supporting documentation of my own. I nodded and stepped forward. From my briefcase, I removed a small stack of files, not bound or clipped, just organized. Audio transcripts, photographs of tampered items in my home, notes from conversations recorded legally and transparently. I offered timestamps. I offered the name of the technician who had assisted in extracting the files from my devices. I handed over a copy of the magazine article, the one from Dr. Eldridge's office, highlighting not the headline, but the citation trail. I noted the trends in psychological weaponization, the statistics around financial exploitation, the growing legal awareness of what I now understood to be a quiet epidemic. The judge did not flinch. She read with speed and accuracy. Her hand moved only to turn the page. Then came the moment I had anticipated. She addressed Dr. Eldridge's report. She read directly from the page. No observable signs of cognitive impairment. Thought structure remains intact and consistent. Emotional regulation appropriate. Behavioral observations support subject's account over petitioner's. External pressure from family dynamic identified as potential source of mischaracterization. She paused, and in that pause, my children shifted in their seats. Then she asked one final question. To me, "Do you feel unsafe?" I answered honestly. Not melodramatically, not with self-pity. I explained that I did not feel unsafe in my home, but I had begun to feel unsafe in the context of my family. That the erosion of trust, when paired with a campaign of misrepresentation, created a different kind of harm. One that did not leave bruises, but extracted dignity in increments. The judge nodded once. She turned to my children, and for the first time in that room, they looked small. She said only what needed to be said. The petition was denied. The record would reflect no incompetence, no need for guardianship, no restrictions. The matter would not be revisited unless new evidence presented itself, and even then, with higher scrutiny. Then she did something unexpected. She closed the file slowly, let her hands rest on it, and she said, quietly but firmly, that family was not immune to self-interest. That concern, when used improperly, could become a mask for coercion. That the law could not mend betrayal, but it could prevent it from becoming doctrine. I left the room without a word to my children. They did not follow. I stepped into the daylight, steady, quiet, unremarkable. The court had not offered justice. It had offered something colder, something truer. It had offered structure, and that, at last, had been enough. I returned home before the sun had fully set. The air outside was dry, heavy with the scent of warming earth and the distant echo of cut grass. The courthouse was already behind me, physically and emotionally, reduced to a memory of still air and procedural finality. I did not speak on the drive back. The silence wasn't intentional. It was structural, like the final page of a well-written report. Not empty, just complete. I parked the car in the exact spot I always did, right along the faded line where the concrete had begun to fracture. I sat there for a moment longer than usual, listening to the engine click as it cooled, the faint rustle of leaves brushing the side of the house. The wind had returned, gentle but persistent, like a question without urgency. I took it as a sign to move. Inside, everything remained untouched. No sign of intrusion, no scent of perfume or cologne not belonging to me. No furniture moved even an inch from where I had last placed it. I checked the lock on the side door out of habit, then stepped into the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it in 3 slow pulls. The house exhaled around me. I walked down the stairs to the basement without turning on the light. I didn't need it. I had mapped the space with my body over decades. Every shelf, every support beam, every edge of every table had been committed to memory, not because of paranoia, but because of respect. You cannot ask a space to protect your past if you do not first honor its present. The basement had always been my sanctuary, though not in the way most would think. There were no plush chairs or soft lamps, no trinkets of sentiment. It was a room built on function. Shelving units lined the walls, filled with carefully labeled boxes. Green, gray, black. Each box marked in my own hand with codes only I understood. Not secrets, systems. I had developed my own taxonomy over the years, a quiet evolution from the formats I'd used in military fieldwork. Paper, like memory, had to be preserved properly, or it collapsed under the weight of its own meaning. I moved to the back wall and pulled out Box 8C. The label read, Familial, Observations, Interventions, Recovery. The last update had been 12 years prior, a letter from my daughter after her mother's funeral, apologizing for not staying longer, folded 3 times and sealed in a plastic sleeve. I removed it, read it once, then added it to the folder marked Inauthentic Regrets. I placed the new documents on top of the existing contents. Dr. Eldridge's report, the court summary, transcripts, photographs, all of it bound in a neutral blue folder, unadorned and final. There was no satisfaction in the act, no swelling of pride or sense of revenge. It was clerical, a conclusion added to a file, a threat neutralized through process. The bureaucratic poetry of the careful man. I returned the box to its place on the shelf and turned to the table in the center of the room. The same table where I had once assembled field kits, repaired radios, reassembled typewriters, refiled satellite photos for black site deployments. It was scratched now, dented in places, the grain worn smooth under my hands over the years. But it remained stable. That, more than anything, mattered now. I sat in the wooden chair and reached for the thick ledger I kept beside the desk lamp. Its spine had cracked from overuse. Inside were hundreds of entries, locations, dates, interactions, events. Every page told the story not of my life, but of its structure. Today, I added a new one. I wrote slowly, with precision, my handwriting still legible and clean. I documented the court's findings, the behavioral patterns observed, the response of each party. I labeled it not with the word victory, but with the word closure. I closed the ledger gently and slid it back into its drawer. Then I pulled open the drawer below it and retrieved an old envelope, marked Future Requests. Inside were 6 sheets of paper, instructions I had written to myself in case of cognitive decline, physical incapacitation, or terminal diagnosis, medical preferences, financial releases, letters to be sent only in the event of death. I reread them, line by line, checking for outdated references. I updated one phone number, crossed out a lawyer's name, and replaced it with another. Then I resealed the envelope and placed it back in the drawer, not out of fear, out of responsibility. That done, I stood and walked to the far end of the room where the steel filing cabinet stood against the foundation wall. The top drawer held the original blueprints of the house. I pulled them out and spread them across the work table. They were faded, but still legible. Every wall, every vent, every corridor accounted for. I had made annotations over the years, small pencil notes about sound paths, shadow zones, airflow. The house had become an extension of my own body, a skin of memory and foresight. I looked at the drawing of the basement and traced the outline of the room I stood in. Then I circled the area marked Storage B and wrote a single word beside it. Secure. Not because it was hidden, because it was whole. I rolled the blueprints and returned them to the cabinet. Then I turned off the single bulb overhead, the kind with a pull chain that clicked once, decisively. In the darkness, the room did not feel empty. It felt preserved, protected, like a vault of memory that no longer needed to defend itself. Upstairs, the clock in the hallway chimed once, a low, restrained note. I climbed the steps without rush. I passed the photo in the hallway, still in its worn frame, and adjusted it by a centimeter. Not for symmetry, for presence. In the living room, I sat in my chair and turned on the lamp. I picked up the book I had been reading, a collection of essays on post-war urban design, and resumed where I had left off. The words came easier now. They no longer competed with distraction. The house was quiet, not tense, not waiting, just quiet. And for the first time in weeks, I realized the silence did not demand anything from me. It simply existed, and I, finally, was allowed to do the same. I woke that morning before the light reached the windows. The house was quiet, not just in sound, but in essence. The kind of stillness that only arrives after something has ended, not like the silence that hangs before conflict or the hush that follows exhaustion. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that comes when nothing more is required. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the radiator click in its familiar rhythm and the occasional creak of old floorboards adjusting to the air. The past weeks had left no wounds on my body, but they had carved their weight into my presence. I felt taller somehow, though not stronger, lighter, but not fragile. The burden that had pressed against my back, against the walls of my home, against the marrow of my name, had shifted, not disappeared, shifted. Enough that I could move again without every gesture feeling like a defense. I showered, shaved, dressed slowly. I took out the same dark sweater I had worn the day I met with Eldridge, pressed flat at the bottom of my drawer like a sealed page. The buttons caught slightly on the thread where I had repaired it once, years ago, after catching it on a hook in the garage. I left it that way. Imperfection is often the best proof that something still matters. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed to life. I prepared my tea with the same measurements I'd used for decades. The precision wasn't habit. It was comfort. The act of measuring, pouring, steeping. It gave the day its spine. I carried the cup into the study and sat at the desk as the light from the window began to spread across the surface like a slow flood. It was warm already. Spring had turned the corner, and the morning birds outside announced it with small, sharp sounds that didn't demand anything in return. I reached for the tape recorder, not the modern one I used for documentation, the old one, black, rectangular, heavy from the inside out. I had used it during my early field years, when interviews were raw and every click of the button felt like a trigger. It still worked. I had replaced the belts, cleaned the heads, kept it functioning not out of nostalgia, but because some tools earn their permanence. I placed a blank cassette inside, one of the few remaining. I had hoarded them over the years, knowing they'd one day become rare, not because the technology had failed, but because people had forgotten the value of physical memory. I pressed record. My voice sounded different through the speaker. I had tested it the night before. Still firm, still controlled, but older. Not in tone, in temperature. The heat had faded from it. I didn't mind. Some truths are best told without fire. I didn't speak names. I didn't recount dates. This final recording wasn't for courtrooms or doctors. It wasn't for my children. It wasn't even for myself. It was for the silence. The one that had lived in this house beside me through every page turned, every drawer opened, every decision that no longer needed to be explained. I spoke for 12 minutes. I talked about the day I moved into the house, how I had chosen it not for its size or charm, but for the quality of its shadow at noon. I spoke about my wife's laugh and how it used to bounce off the kitchen tiles like a dropped spoon. I talked about the old oak out front, and how one summer I had spent a week building a bird feeder just to outsmart the squirrels. I spoke of structure, of patience, of how intelligence isn't the same thing as kindness, but without kindness, intelligence becomes cruelty with vocabulary. I admitted that I had once been afraid of becoming obsolete. Not irrelevant, I knew I'd never be that, but invisible. Reduced to a shadow on the wall of other people's opinions. I said that fear had passed, not because I had proven anything to anyone, but because I had remembered that disappearance is only defeat when it happens without intention. I stopped the recording just before the 13th minute, a small act of symbolism. 13 had always been my number, not for luck, but for balance. The odd step after the even stride. The space between symmetry. I labeled the cassette in pencil, HF, final entry, and slipped it into a small wooden box lined with felt. It sat beside other tapes, fragments of field reports, interviews, thoughts recorded at 2 a.m. when my hands were too tired to write. I placed it at the end, like the last book on a shelf, and closed the lid. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes rest on the bookshelf across the room. Each volume held pieces of me, not in the stories they told, but in the moments I chose to keep them. I knew them all by weight. I could tell you, blindfolded, which one had a folded page on leadership, and which one still smelled faintly of cigar smoke from a night I never spoke about. Outside, the wind had shifted. The sunlight grew stronger, the kind of light that made the dust visible in the air, tiny motes catching the glow, dancing briefly, then disappearing. I watched them without blinking. There were no phone calls that day, no knocks at the door, no emails that required response. My children had gone quiet since the hearing. I expected as much. Silence is what follows when a plan collapses and no one wants to name the debris. I did not hate them. I had removed the need. What they had done in fear. And fear is a poor architect. By late afternoon, I returned to the basement. Not to organize, not to sort, just to sit. The air was cooler there. The concrete held the memory of colder months. I lit the old desk lamp, the one with the warm amber hue, and pulled open the bottom drawer where I kept personal notes. I removed a single page, handwritten, unsent, a letter to no one in particular. A reminder that I had known what was happening even before the evidence arrived. I read it one last time, and then burned it in the small ceramic dish I had kept for exactly that purpose. The flame was quick. The smoke rose like a thought released from obligation. I returned upstairs, made dinner without sound. No radio, no television, no music, just the steady rhythm of the knife, the simmer of the pan, the weight of the plate in my hand. I ate slowly, cleaned up, wiped the counter, turned off the lights one by one. That night, before bed, I stood by the window and looked out across the yard. The grass had grown a little wild. I decided I would not trim it. Let it grow. Let the wind decide its direction. Not everything needed order anymore. I turned off the lamp and lay down. I listened to the silence, and it listened back.